Hey guys, so this is the second part in a three-part series on building out a books app using React, Airtable and Netlify. If you haven't watched the first part, you should go back and watch that because that's where I explain what we're going to be building and we look at the kind of finished product as well as talk about some of the like what Airtable is and some of the higher level stuff. In this video, we're going to be looking at the front end. And we're going to build the front end using React and a bunch of CSS. Now, this is quite a long video because we're starting out with nothing. We're starting out with a completely blank canvas and we're going to code up absolutely everything. So I'm not going to be pulling in any CSS from anywhere else. We're going to write all of it up as part of this video. So that's why it's kind of long. If you're already comfortable with CSS and you want to skip over those bits, feel free to do so. Remember, there is a third part to this series as well, where we're going to look at hooking up Airtable and Netlify. But this is just about building the front end with a mocked out API and also writing up the CSS so that it looks nice. If you haven't checked out the first video, go do that now and come back here when you're done. Cool. So I'm just on my desktop here. And the first thing we need to do is spin up a React app. So we're going to do that with Create React App. And if you haven't come across Create React App, it's an absolutely amazing tool which basically gives us a load of the boilerplate that we need to get started. So I can spin up a new Create React App project just by typing npx Create React App and then giving it a name. So we'll call this like, I don't know, bookie thing. Okay, so now that's done and we've got all of the like npm stuff installed. That took a little while, so I've skipped ahead. We need to add a couple of packages which we're going to use. So I'm going to be using normalize in order to reset the CSS, and I'm also going to be using Sass rather than plain old CSS. So I just need to add those packages, which we can do with yarn add node Sass, and I also want to add normalize dot CSS. Okay, so I've just opened that up in VS Code and we can see that Create React App has made a commit for us with all the kind of initial setup here. And if we have a look inside here, we've got like a bunch of stuff. And what I normally like to do when I start working on a new React app is tidy up some of what Create React App gives us. So I guess there's a couple of little bits that we want to have a play around with. First of all, I'm going to get rid of this logo because we don't need that. We don't need that anymore. And then I'm going to come and switch out app.css so that it's a Sass file. So I'm just going to change it to app.scss, and I'm going to get rid of this test because we don't need that. We're not doing any testing here. And then in app.scss, we're just going to tidy up some basic stuff in here. So I'm going to get rid of this import for the logo. We're going to change this to import app.scss. I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff down here so that we're just returning a div with a class of app for now. And then inside that, we might want to have, say, a paragraph which just says hello world. Cool. And then I'm also actually just going to switch this out to be a lowercase class name. I tend to prefer lowercase classes. And then we're just going to head over to our app.scss. I'm going to get rid of everything in here. We'll just set it to have like a background of like goldenrod or something for now. Okay. I'm also going to get rid of these semicolons because I don't like semicolons. And then over in our index.js, we can leave most of this as it is, but we're just going to change this to index.scss. And then we're still going to import the app just as we did before. And then finally, I just need to change this index.css to be index.scss. And then I kind of want to add in some like basic stylings, which I like to put in a lot of projects. So this basic stuff on the body can stay. I'm going to set some stuff up on HTML. And I'm just going to set the box sizing to border box so that we can use percentage widths and stuff if we need to. I'm also going to set the font size to 1 rem and the line height to like 1.4, some basically bigger amount. And then I'm also going to set some ligatures for font variants, just because I think these can often make typography look nice. And again, because we might be doing a little bit of scrolling stuff later on, I'm just going to set up this scroll behavior to smooth, which is just something I like to do on nearly all of my projects. And then because we want to inherit this box sizing onto all of the elements, I'm just going to come and set up on all of the elements and on all of the elements, and also on all of the before elements and on all of the after elements. So that's basically all of the pseudo elements plus all the normal elements. And we're just going to tell that to inherit box sizing from the root. So they'll all get this border box sizing. I'm also going to reset the padding on paragraphs because at the moment they're all going to have margin, not padding even, which I can just do like that. And then we've got that stuff's reset on the body, and we've got some decent font stuff in here, so it's going to use Apple system font and that kind of thing. And the last thing that I want to do, which we haven't done yet, is bring in that normalize. So we haven't actually got that anywhere at the moment. So to do that, I'm just going to head over to index.js. And before we bring in our own kind of global CSS styling, we're just going to bring in normalize. So we can just say import normalize.scss. I'm also going to come over to the README and just clear that out, put some basic stuff in here. So books app. I didn't want to do that. There we are. Cool. And having done all that stuff, we're just going to check it works by running yarn start. And that should fire up our React project for us. Okay, so that's fired up the app, and we've just got that up here. And there's actually an error because over here I put in normalize.scss, which isn't a thing. So let's just try fixing that. And hopefully we will get our hello world. And there we are. So we've got the CSS styles being correctly applied and brought in from our index.scss, which is like bringing in all this basic stuff. We've also got normalize being pulled in, and we've also got in our main app component, we've got this background of goldenrod being pulled in. So we're kind of set up and ready to go here in order to start building the stuff that we need. Cool. So what we want to do now is head over to our app component, and we're basically going to start setting this up so it pulls in our book data from somewhere. So the first thing that we want to think about is adding a bit of state into here. So we need some state on our app, which is going to hold all of the books. So we can do that because we're using class-based components here by defining a constructor, which needs to take in some props. And And then what we want to do in here, essentially, as ever, is do this super props thing. And then we basically want to set the current state for the app component to an empty array, which we're then going to populate. Okay, so we can do that with this dot state, and we want to set that to have an array called books, which is just going to be an empty array, and that's where we're going to put our books when we get them back. And then because we want to show some sort of spinner or loading thing while we're getting the books, I'm just going to add another piece of state called isLoaded, which we're going to initialize to false. And that's basically going to allow us to decide, like, what we should show conditionally in our render method. So if we want to deal with that stuff down here now, we can basically put in some maybe like a variable. So we can use destructuring inside our render method, and we can say let, and we want to get in these 2 bits of data. So is loaded and say items. So that's our books, and we can get that from the state. So what this is going to do, it's going to initialize an isLoaded variable inside here to like whatever this is, and it's going to do the same thing with the books array. Maybe we should call this books. Maybe we should call this books actually. Cool. So now that we've got these variables, we can do some simple conditional stuff in here, and we can basically say if not isLoaded, then we want to render out some, I don't know, something really simple. So for now, let's just do a paragraph tag saying loading. Otherwise is if. Otherwise, we want to render out all of the actual books. Okay, down here. So in this case, like, let's change this to be like, these are the books. We're getting a warning here saying that we're not using this books variable, but that makes sense because we're not actually using it yet. So that's kind of us set up with our loading thing. We can see that this is working, right? Because isLoaded is set to false. It's showing us this stuff. This is what's being rendered out here. And what we basically want to do is we want to use a lifecycle method now to go and get our books from somewhere. So we're going to add a method called component did mount, which comes with React. And in here, we're basically going to do the stuff which like gets our to-dos and then sets the state. So we want to like get the to-dos. Where did that come from? Get the books. And then we want to do any parsing that we need to do. So like turn them from JSON into JavaScript objects. And then we want to update the books state to contain the books. And then we finally want to update the isLoaded state to be true. So like that's what we've got to do now. But before we do any of this, we need to have somewhere to actually get our books from. Now, because dealing with the Airtable API is a bit of a nightmare and is a little bit fiddly, I'm actually just going to do something very different now. We're actually just going to go ahead and create a new gist. And we're going to kind of make like a mock API where we can get stuff from. So I'm just going to call this like my books.json. And we're basically going to invent our API and how we want this to work here. Now, I've actually got a load of this stuff, which I set up beforehand. So I'm just going to copy and paste this into here. And then we're going to save it. Cool. So what we've got here is this gist, and this basically describes how we want our books API to send stuff back. So we've got an ID on each of our books. It's an array which has 2 JSON objects in it, and each object representing a book has got an ID, which is some unique ID, a title, a boolean which says whether it's complete or not, a progress, which is an integer, a finished on date, and we can see down here this one has been finished, an author, a rating, which is a boolean, and a couple of tags, which is an array that contains a couple of strings, the review, which contains a string, and also this image URL. And I've just uploaded a couple of book images to a server that I have somewhere. But you could use image URLs directly from Google or whatever here. So this is like our pretend API, basically. Later on, we're going to look at how do we use Airtable to return stuff that looks exactly like this from the Airtable API. So this is what we want, and this is how we're going to kind of build our front end by using this fake API. So if we head over and just hit this raw thing here, this is going to give us a URL which will return the raw content a bit like an API would. So we can just take this and use this in our code. So all we're going to do inside our component did mount is we're going to use fetch, and we're going to say go and fetch this URL. And then when we've done that, that returns a promise, so we need to use then. We then want to basically get the response and take the JSON out of that response, which we can do like this. So if we get the response, this takes a function, and we want that function to get the JSON. Now this will return a promise. So then what we can do is, given the JSON that contains all of the stuff that we need, we can inside here, inside this kind of inside this function, we can update our state. So we've done these first two things, step 1 and step 2. So now we need to update the state. So we can just say this dot state and set that. In fact, we can't. We have to say this dot set state, and we're going to set the state to the books. And we want that to be whatever this JSON is, because this will be in the right format. So this will return a JavaScript object which has the right stuff. And then we're just going to replace the books array, that empty array we had, with this array that we've got back from the API. And then we also want to update, just to tick off that last thing, point 4, we want to update the isLoaded variable to be true. And there we are. So we've ticked off all of these things. We've got the books, which happens up here with the fetch. Then if that's okay, we're going to pass that and take out the JSON, turn that into JavaScript objects. And then we're going to update the book state to contain the books. And then we're going to update, the isLoaded state to be true. And what this should mean is that down here, we've now got these books available. So we can see when this runs, if I refresh that, we get this loading, which kind of happened too quickly there to see, right? And then when that comes back, we've now got these books available in the state. And if we wanted to just check that they've come in, we can open up the inspector and have a look over here at the React inspector. And we should be able to see on our apps, we now have this books array, and it's got those two things in it, which have come back from GitHub with all of that detail. So just to make sure that this is working properly, what we're going to do is change this down here so that we are mapping over each of these books and printing out something. So inside our app, instead of just printing out that paragraph, we're going to maybe put a load of paragraphs each with the book title in it. So we can say books, which comes from this variable, .map. And then inside here, we want to have the book, and we also want the index. And then we want that to return a paragraph with the book title. So we're just going to get the book and then get the title. I think it was called the title, was it? Yeah, title. Cool. And there we are. We've got our book titles coming back. Now, if you have a look in the console down here, we might well see that we've got an error. And that's an error basically saying each child of an iterator should have a unique key property. And that's why we want to put index in here. So we need to add a key to these paragraphs, which we could do like this. We're just going to use this index. So the key will be like 1, 2, 3, 4, and it will count through them. Having said that, if we look at the stuff that comes back from our API, we've actually got this unique ID attribute, which we're already getting back, and we can rely on that being unique. So I'm actually just going to change this so that instead of using an index, we're going to use the book.id, and that means that we can get rid of this. Cool. And there we are. So we've got our kind of basics working. We've got this loading indicator, which is going to show up when it's going to get the books. And then we're getting back from our fake API on GitHub. We're getting back a series of all the books, and we're mapping over all of them and rendering out a paragraph for each. So the next thing that we want to do is take a look at styling some of this stuff up, because it doesn't look very nice at the moment. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is have a look at styling this up. And we're going to start with this loading indicator, because it's not really ideal having like just a paragraph there. What we want to do instead is put a spinner in here. So we're going to make our first component, which is just going to be a spinner. And what we'll end up with when we save that is an error saying that that's not defined. So we need to go and import this. Now we haven't made it yet, but if we head up to the top and import spinner from component spinner, and then we need to go and make this directory structure. So we're going to make a folder called components, and then inside of this we're going to create another folder called spinner. This is going to contain all the stuff that we need for our spinner component. And then inside here, we want to create 3 files. So I'm going to make a file called spinner.js, which is actually going to hold the component. And because I don't really like, if we just wanted to require this in, we'd have to up here do something like require or import spinner from component /spinner/spinner. And I don't really like doing that because I just think it's kind of messy and a bit weird. So I like to create an index.js file in here. And basically in here we're going to define our actual spinner, and in this thing all we're going to do is say import import spinner from like this spinner.js, and then straight away we're just going to export that as the default, and that means that we don't need to type that extra spinner when we're importing this. Cool. And then I also want to create a CSS file or a Sass file, and I'm just going to call that spinner.module.scss, and that means it's going to use CSS modules basically, so it will scope all of the styles in here to the component. So what we want to do now over in our spinner is we want to actually define our spinner component, which is going to be a functional component. So as with any React component, we need to import React from React. We also want to bring in the styles because we're using CSS modules. So I'm going to say import styles from, and then bring in the SCSS file we made. And then we can start defining our component, which is just going to be functional. So function spinner, and that needs to take in the props. And then we want this to return some stuff. So for now, let's just return a div with a class name of foo. And then inside here, like, let's just, I don't know, put a paragraph saying like hello, just to check it's working. Cool. And then we need to export this as ever. And that's got rid of our errors. So let's just check. We could kind of see that working there, but if we just head back over to our app.js, because we're working with this spinner here, I'm actually just going to flip this boolean so that we end up with this like all the time. And there we are. So we've got our spinner being rendered out there. So what do we actually want in here? Well, I'm just going to have like a container here, and I want to have two styles. So I want to have a spinner, and then I want to have another div called just spin wheel. And we're just going to style up these two things here. Cool. So if we head over to our CSS file, we've got our spinner and we've also got a spin wheel. So let's start off with the spinner. I basically want to center all the stuff that's in here. So I can do that with Flexbox. And let's set the width to 100% and let's set the height to 100%. These won't always make a difference, but they will sometimes. And then we want to say align items center and justify content center. So that's gonna center align everything in the middle of here. And now we want to come down and actually like set up our spin wheel. So inside of here, I'm just going to come down and say, okay, get the spin wheel. And let's give that a width of, say, 5 rem and a height of 5 rem. And let's give it a background just so we can see what we're doing. And we can't see that. Why can't we see that? That's because it's got no content, I think. Oh no, wait, but I've given it a width and a height. I know why. It's because these things aren't being pulled in properly. Cool. So the way that CSS styles works is that rather than defining these, because I've defined this as a module, these things are actually going to be prefixed with like a unique, like a big long unique number, which is how they can scope them. So what we actually need to do, instead of just defining spinner here, we need to say like some big long number that we don't know, and then this. And the way that we get that is by accessing this styles variable that we've got up here. So if I just call styles.spinner, and then I do the same thing here for spin wheel, we should be in business. There we are, cool. And if we actually have a look, if you want to see what's going on there, if we inspect this, we should be able to see down here, we've got this like spin wheel thing, and we've got this like unique identifier that's been kind of put in by CSS modules. So that's why we had to do that. Cool. So let's go and add some styles to this then. What we want to do is we want to create a pseudo element on this spinner, which we're then going to rotate. So I want to make this into a like like an extra element that's going to sit in the same place as this. So I can do that by saying, okay, get the spin wheel, and then after it, we want to make a pseudo element with no content in it, and then we want to set it to display block, and we want to set the width and height to the same as we did in here. And then we're going to set the border radius to 50%. And if we put a background on that, we can see like we've got like a round thing now. We've got a circle because of this 50% background that's sitting directly on top of our spin wheel. And then basically I'm just going to set a border on this, right? So let's set like a 7 pixel solid border that is like a transparent black. So that's kind of worked. And then this is a trick that I picked up from somewhere online when I was looking at how to do this. Having done that, we can basically set the border color on a per bit basis. So I can say like set the border top color to like red or whatever. So I could say something like border color, and I can give this a bunch of variables. So I could say like red, green, red, green. Okay, red was a bad choice. And you can see we've kind of got these green bits. Like if I take that background off the element, we've got these like the border top is yellow and the same as the bottom, and then the left and right are green. But instead of doing this, we can basically set the yellow bits to be this nice black color that we've got. And then for these bits, we'll just set them to be transparent instead of green. And now we've got this kind of spinnerish looking thing. Cool. And then all we need to do is animate this. So we can come down the bottom here and we can set up a keyframes animation, which we'll call spin. And we basically want to say at 0%, then we should transition it with a rotation to like 0 degrees. And then at 100%, we want to rotate it all the way around at 360 degrees. And now we need to basically set up that in here so that this pseudo element is going to use that, which we can do with animation spin, and let's do it like 1.5 seconds. So it'll spin infinitely. Why is that not spinning? Spin, spin. Oh, it's because I put transition instead of transform. There we are. Or maybe not. Okay, I just did the same thing. Transform. There we are. That's better. There we are. Cool. So now we've got our thing spinning. And for me, that's kind of cool. Like we've got a spinner. The only thing that's maybe not so nice about this is these heights, which are hard coded, and also these colors that we've got in here, which are hard coded. So I could use CSS variables for this, but I'm actually going to pull them out into a couple of Sass variables called color, and we'll set that to this kind of dark color. And then we can replace instances of that with our variable. So that should still work. And then I also want to do the same thing with this size, this kind of 5 rem size, because that defines how big our spinner is. Cool. And there's our spinner. So we can just take that background off, that red background. And we have a spinner. Actually, that's kind of a bit dark, so let's maybe make that a bit lighter. Cool. So there's the spinner working. But what I'd quite like to do is make this spinner so it's in the center of the screen and is like on an overlay. Now, we could, if we wanted to, just do that all in here for the spinner. But I feel like maybe we're going to want to use this spinner in some other context where we don't want it on the whole screen. So what I actually want to do is head back over to our app.js and wrap this in an overlay. So if we just call this kind of say overlay, and then put the spinner in it, what we've got now is an overlay component, and this is obviously going to break because we haven't defined it yet, but an overlay component which we can style up to basically put an overlay on the screen, and anything that's inside of that, in this case the spinner, is going to be centered in that on top of it. So let's go define our overlay component. So we want to import it in just the same way. And then we want to make another folder in here. Called overlay. And then in here we want our 3 files. So overlay.js, index.js, and overlay.module.css. Cool. So in here, this is exactly the same pattern as we had in the spinner. So I might as well just grab that code and paste that into here. And then we just want to change this to overlay. And then in our overlay.js, we need to pull in React. And in fact, we might as well do the same thing here. Let's just nick this code and paste it into here. But this wants to be overlay.module.css. This wants to be overlay. We're good. But we want to think a little bit about how this overlay thing should work. So it should be a div, which is what we've got, and then we basically want to say, okay, get the styles for that overlay, and then inside of it, put in like other stuff that comes back. So we want to get the children of in here. We want to get the children of this overlay component, which we can get through the props. So we can say props.children, and our spinners come back. And if we have a look underneath here now at the HTML, we should be able to see that we've got this spin wheel, but it's in this div, okay, which we've just added in, and this is our overlay div, and we need to add some styles to that. So let's have a look at the styles that we might want for our overlay. Overlay, yeah, cool. So we've got our overlay here. Let's start off by putting a background on it of, say, red. And there we are, the overlay is kind of working. We've got this on top of it. we probably want to give it a fixed position so it sits on top of everything. So we can say position fixed. And let's give it a background that's perhaps not red. Let's give it like a, I don't know, a transparent background maybe. So maybe like 0.4. So that's like a transparent red overlay now. And because we set position fixed, we also need to make sure that this fills up the entire screen, which we can do by saying height is 100 VH and width is 100 VW. And now that overlay is taking up our entire screen, and because we set up our spinner component to use Flexbox and justify content and align items to the center, this is always going to appear in the middle of our overlay now. So there we are, we've got an overlay. I'm not sure I like the red, so let's actually set this to be a white overlay, which we're not going to see a great deal of difference now. But if we have other content underneath this, we'd be able to see that overlay sitting on top of that other content. Cool. So we've just built an overlay and we've built a spinner. And if we come and have a look at our app.js, we're now rendering those out instead of the loading indicator that we had. So we've done the loading thing. So I'm just going to add back in that switch there so that we get the loading operator for a second, and then it loads up our items that we've got in our books. Cool. So next thing we want to look at is actually getting to grips with this books thing. So at the moment we're rendering out just a paragraph with a book title in it, and what we actually want to do here is render out a book instead. So for now, let's just render out a book component, and we'll put all the basics in place for that. So for each book, we're rendering out this book component and giving it a key, and that's it for now. But we've got to go up here and bring in our book component. Cool, and there we are. So we've got our two books now. The problem we've got at the moment is that inside books.js, we don't have any of the data that we kind of need coming in. We don't have we don't have any of the properties. So we need to send all of the details of the book down as props. So if we head back over to our app.js, what we basically want to do in here is give this a whole load of properties. So we want to say like title is book.title, and that will make this title available to us. So if I do that, actually, we've now got a prop for our book called title, and that's got the book's title in it. So if we were to head over to our book.js and say like, hey, and then use the props.title, we can see that's working for us. But it's a bit of a pain having to do that for all of the properties that we've got. We need to do it for the title, we need to do it for all of these things, title, whether it's complete, progress, etc. So what I'm actually going to do is use the spread operator here, which is a kind of nice thing that we can do in React. I'm able to say pass down all of the properties that are in book, so all of these things, and this will pass them all down as props. Okay, so having done that, if we have a look at this, should still work because the title's still there. But if we come and have a look at these in the inspector, if my inspector will work, so if we come and have a look at the React tab, and we dig in here and have a look at this book, we can see that like all these props are being set on there, and that's all being passed down just from this spread operator. Now we'll add some prop types later on to confirm that they are all there, but this is quite a neat way if we're getting data back from an API where we know what we're going to get. It's quite a neat way of passing them all down. So now that we've got those props available in here, we can start to actually build out our HTML that we want to render. So instead of rendering out a paragraph, let's instead render an article tag, and let's give that a class of book, but we've got to use styles so that we get that CSS module stuff. And then inside here, let's put a picture element. We'll see why later on, because we might want to use different size pictures. Let's give that a class name of styles dot picture. And then inside here, let's have an image, and we want to give that a source of props dot, and then we want whatever this is, so it's image URL. So props.image URL. And we also want to give in alt because that's good practice. And that can be props.title. Cool. So that's our image tag done. Helps if I put me back it's in the right place. So we've got an image in here now, and then let's also bring in a few other things. So let's maybe have an H1, which can have the title in it. And then let's have a maybe an H2, which has the author. And then let's put in some other stuff. So maybe we want that star rating in here somewhere. So let's have a look at what we got actually. So we've got the title, we've got we haven't used this complete yet, but that's fine. Let's look at the rating. So let's say, okay, let's just have a paragraph, and in here we can say props.rating, and then maybe let's just do a bunch of paragraphs for now. So let's have props.progress. And then finally, let's do something with let's have a paragraph. Let's just have the tags, right? So props.tags. Cool. So there's our article. And let's see what that does. Cool. So something's working there. Well, so those images are very, very big. We can fix that with a bit of CSS, but we can see we've got the title is an H1, we've got an H2 with the author, we've got this thing which is the rating, and then we've got these tags which are like stuck together. So let's look at displaying some of these a bit more like we want to for our kind of final result. So first of all, let's look at this rating. We want to display this instead of as a series of, like as an integer, we want to display it as a series of stars. So we can do that by saying, okay, let's get the rating, and let's basically return a star emoji, and let's repeat that for however many times the props.rating is. And there we are, we've got our stars here, and then we've got an empty string coming out for this one because it has 0 stars. We also want to do some stuff probably with the tags. So that's an array. So let's map over that. And let's return from that a what should we do? Maybe return a span, which has the tag in it. And this just means that we can style it using some stuff. So let's just have a look at that. And it's not going to look any different, but okay, yeah, tag, that's not what we want. That's obviously work though. Cool. So we've got our tags wrapped in a span, in a paragraph, and then we've got our title and author. This progress is a bit weird though. We probably want to have a progress bar for that. So let's use a progress indicator. So let's use the progress HTML progress tag, and the value wants to be whatever the actual progress is, and then the maximum wants to be 100. Cool. Cool. So we've got a progress bar there now, which is great. So we're kind of getting there with this, but we probably want to do some other stuff before we get on to styling this up. So if we look at the original, if we just go and look at that original, we've got the progress bar showing up if it's not finished, as in if the book is incomplete, it shows the progress. If it is complete, we want it to show the progress bar instead. And then we want the tags to come at the end. So let's put some conditional stuff in here to deal with that. So the first thing I kind of want to do, I don't really like having this tag business in here. So up in our functional component here, I'm just going to define a variable for the tags. So we can say let tags equal some JSX, and then we can just grab this stuff in here and stick that in there. So let's wrap that actually in a paragraph, so we've got the whole thing. Cool. So is that going to work? That's not going to work because I'm missing a bracket. There we are. Cool. So tags is a variable now that's got a paragraph in it. And what have I done wrong here? Map over them. Return that. That's the opening of the map. Yeah, it should be fine, I think. Cool. So that's going to be a paragraph that returns these spans here, and we'll come back to this later on. And what that means is that down here, I can just bring in my tags from that variable. So that shouldn't change how it works. And there we are. We got these tags still coming in. And now I kind of want to do something which says, all right, bring in the star rating only if it's complete. Otherwise, bring in some other stuff. So I want to be able to say up here, let's define a variable called, say, metadata. And then let's use some conditional logic to just say, like, if the thing is complete. So if props.complete, then we want to, we basically want to return the rating. Otherwise, we want to return the progress bar. So we can pull that stuff out. We can just say, okay, the rating, let's grab that paragraph and just say, in this case, let metadata equal that bit of JSX. Otherwise, we want metadata to equal our progress bar. Cool. So that's going to mean that like at this point here, metadata is going to contain either this thing or it's going to contain the progress bar. So that's kind of cool. So now we can come down here and we can replace this stuff with our metadata. Cool. Hopefully that will work. Maybe not. Did I spell that wrong? I know why. It's because I'm redefining it here, and that's me being silly. I don't want to redefine it. I want to update the one that we set in there, the kind of global scope of this function here. Cool, there we are. So basically all we're doing here, we pulled out our tags into its own little thing, and then we're setting up a variable in the scope of this, this function. And then inside our if statement, we're updating that to contain the rating if it's complete. Otherwise, we're updating it to have the progress bar, and then we're just using that stuff down here. Cool. So that's kind of us done for the HTML. And we've got all that stuff rendering out. We can see we've got the progress bar for the unfinished one and the stars for the finished one. So now we want to go and have a look at styling this up so that it looks a little bit nicer. So let's go and take a look at our CSS file. Cool. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually give this a width of, say, like, I don't know, 400 pixels. It's probably a bit small actually. Just so that like we don't have that massive picture getting in the way, basically. Cool. Well, that'll work in a minute when we've actually like written some CSS to make it work. So let's have a look at the picture for now. What we want to do is set this to display block. So this is the thing that contains the image element. If we set that to display block and set the width to always be 100%, and then I also want to put a margin on the bottom of this of, say, of say 1 rem, just to push the stuff underneath it down a bit. Cool. That has not done what I hoped it would do. It's because the image is still, we haven't done anything with the image. So let's grab that image now and do the same thing with that. So display block and then set the width to 100%. There we are. Cool, that's a bit better. So we've constrained these now to the same size as the picture element. And then we put a bit of a margin on the bottom of this picture element to just push this title down a little bit. I also want to put a box shadow on the picture element, which is just going to make it stand out from the page a bit. If we kind of have a look at this, they've got this nice shadow on them. So let's add a box shadow to the picture of, so we don't want it to go down, but we don't want it to go across, but we do want it to go down by, say, 5 pixels, and a blur of, say, 10 pixels, and then maybe 0.3. Cool, so we've got that nice shadow on the bottom of it now. Awesome. Cool. So let's have a look at some of these other headings then. Up here we've kind of got this max width for the book. Let's put some padding around the book, just so that it's kind of got, it sits on its own a little bit more. So let's put some padding, maybe just on the bottom actually. of, say, 1 rem, which is just going to space it out a little bit down here. And then let's look at the progress element. So inside the book, we want the progress element to be 100% wide all the time, which fills that out, which is kind of nice. And then let's look at the heading 1 in there and set a margin of nothing on that. And let's make it uppercase. Cool. Maybe a bit heavier. What does that look like? Okay, it's a bit lighter. Cool. And then I kind of like when we're doing this thing with all caps to add a bit of letter spacing. So if I make that like 0.05 rem, spread them out a tiny little bit, and then let's set the color to something transparent. Maybe like 0.8. Cool. And then we want to look at the H2. So let's, what do I want to do with that? I tell you what, actually, I think if we look at this original, these titles are kind of heavy and this is a bit smaller. So let's actually swap what we've done there and put these styles on for the H2. And then for the H1, let's just leave it as it is, but put a bit of a margin on it. Cool. In fact, let's put it on the bottom. Yeah, cool. So let's just put a little bit of margin on the right and the left of it. So this is the top. Cool. So we're kind of looking all right. The only bit that doesn't look so good here at the moment to me is this this thing here. These tags probably want to look a little bit different. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could either come over to our book and we could put a class on this. But because a tag's a thing that I feel might be reused a bit, what I'd actually like to do is turn this into a component. So I'd like to say tag and then give it a label as a prop. And then we're going to need to define this. So let's go and do that now. Let's define a new component, which we want to bring in here. So we want to bring that in from 1 level up. And now we need to go and define our tag component. So new folder, tag. And then we want our new files, index.js, tag.js, and tag.module.scss. Cool. And then I'm just going to nick that stuff out of Spinner again. So index.js wants this stuff. And tag.js wants this stuff. Cool. And all we're going to do in here is just return a span like we had before. So rather than returning all this stuff, we're just going to return a span with a class name of styles.tag. And then inside of that, we just need to bring in the label from our props. And we need to change this to tag. Cool. So we've got a tag thing which takes one prop which is label, and that just renders out a span just like we had before. And that should mean that if we save that, we get back our tags, which are working just as they were before. Only now we've got a component for them. And this means that we can come over into our tag module CSS and start styling this up in like its own little place, which is cool. So what do we want to do for the tag? Let's make it uppercase. Let's give it some spacing of say 0.07 rem. Let's give it a font size that's a bit smaller. Maybe 0.8 actually. Let's give it a color. It's a bit lighter maybe. Cool, so that's worked. And then let's give it some background. And finally, let's give it some padding of say 0.2 rem on the top and bottom and 0.5 rem on the sides. And then maybe let's give it some margin right of say 0.2 rem. Cool. So there we are. We've got a couple of tags which look a bit more tag-like now. Sweet. So we've got our tag component. We've got our book component, which brings back, deals with all the books basically. And the only thing that isn't so ideal at the moment is that we've got a fixed width on these. So these are 400 pixels wide. We can make them 200 pixels wide, and all that stuff will kind of still work. So what we really want to do here is we want to set up some way of changing the width of this depending on how it's laid out. And we're actually going to do that using CSS grid and a layout container. Cool. So we've already kind of made a layout container. When we made this overlay thing, it's basically a very simple container that we wrap other stuff in, and it uses props.children to just change how the stuff we give it inside of it are displayed. And along with CSS grid, layout containers are one of the things I think is absolutely awesome about building out systems in React. So if we want to build one to lay out our books across the screen, we can start off using this overlay thing. We need to build another component. So all we've done there is just set this up exactly the same as we did with the overlay, except that this div is bringing back a thing with the book grid class on it. What that means is that we can use this book grid now over in our app.js. So instead of just returning all of these books loose in our app div, we can wrap them in a book grid component. And then we're going to need to add this end tag down here. And then of course we need to bring in our book grid. And we should find that that builds with no errors. So nothing's changed over here, except that we've now got this stuff wrapped in a book grid container. And we're going to use CSS grid for this, which makes it really, really easy to lay stuff out. So our book grid is basically just going to say, okay, set all of its children to be items in a grid. Okay, and we can do that just by setting up a grid. So if I just say display grid, and then we give it a grid template. Of say 1FR, 1FR, what we should find is that that's made two grid columns. next to each other. And so our items are now sat on a grid with 2 next to each other. If I change that to 1FR, 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 FR is a new unit for CSS grid, we'll see that there's like 3 slots here. We've only got 2 books, so it's going to put like an empty slot in the grid here. And this is exactly what we want in order to display these things. So if we want to put a bit of a gap between these, because at the moment these don't really have a gap between them, but we can do that with a grid gap of, say, 2 rem. Ooh, grid gap. Now, one of the really nice things about this kind of approach is if we look at the original, we've got these books here, and they kind of get bigger and smaller, and the grid changes to have either 3 items or 2 items, or at small viewports 1 item on it. And we can do all that stuff with media queries. But CSS variables make it really, really easy for us to do this, and also for us to change the size of the grid with JavaScript after the fact if we need to. So I'm just going to set up on the root element of the HTML. I'm just going to set up a CSS variable called column count. And we're just going to set that to 1 to start with. And then all we're going to do down here, instead of having to like type out this, if we want 3 columns, it's like 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. If we wanted 4 columns, I'd have to add that in here. And that's a bit of a pain in the arse. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to use this repeat function, which comes with CSS grid. And we're going to say repeat whatever this variable is. So we could say like repeat once 1FR. And that's the equivalent to just 1FR. And if we said repeat 2, it would be the equivalent to doing this. So what we want to do is instead of repeating twice or once or whatever, we want to repeat whatever this column count is. So we can replace that with var column count. And that should mean that we've got 1 column now in our grid when we come and look at this, which we have. Okay, we've actually got a fixed width on these as well, which is why they're kind of small. So let's go and take that fixed width off our book, wherever it is, book, so that these are 100% width. And what we should see now is that we get this massive thing because we've got 1 column and it's the whole width, right? But now, of course, if I come over here and I change this to be 2, we're going to end up with 2 columns, and that grid column gap is what's giving us this gap in the middle here. And if I wanted that to be 3, we'll end up with 3 columns. And I could keep going. If I made that like 6, we'd end up with 6 column slots for all of these things, which is kind of cool. And because we're using CSS variables, if I go and look at the inspector, I can just change this down here. I can just change this CSS variable to say 3. Ooh. And we've got 3 columns, or 2, or 6, or 4, or whatever, right? And that's really useful because wherever we're at in the app, we can change the layout of this by just changing this column count variable. So let's go ahead and put in some media queries. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste these media queries in. And basically all they're doing is they're saying like, by default, we want this to have a grid column count of 1. And then when we get over a certain size, over 550 pixels, we want to just change that variable to 2. And then when we get over 850, change it to 3 and then to 4. And this is really nice because it's just what we did before in the console. We're using media queries to change just a variable, and that's going to affect our entire layout because of CSS grid. And having done that, we end up with this nice layout where when we're really narrow, we've got 1 column. And then we go to 2 columns, and then we go to 3 columns, and then eventually we go to 4 columns. And everything scales exactly as you'd expect. So there we are. The only other thing that we might want to do is go add a little bit of padding, maybe onto this container. Or maybe we want to add a bit of padding onto our app. So if we head over to app.js or app.css, I might just want to add a little bit of padding. Of say 2 rem here, just to make this look a little bit nicer. And then maybe change that background to something that's not so horrible. I don't know. And there we are. We've basically got this set up. Obviously, we haven't talked at all yet about taking what we've built here and pulling in data from a real place. At the moment, we're just pulling in this dummy data. But in the next video, we'll take a look at replacing this with a Lambda function and deploying the whole thing up to Netlify so that we're getting our real books from Airtable. So I hope that was useful. Make sure you hit the subscribe button down there so that you get notified when I publish part 3. And if you're watching from sometime in the future, check out my videos on YouTube because part 3 will be there. Otherwise, hit me up on Twitter, which I think is up there. I'm Danny Smith on Twitter. So say hello. And if you've got any questions, drop me a comment down there. Cheers.